Hi, it's Joshua Townsend. So good for you to come by. I really appreciate it. Today we're talking about the creative process as always. And today we're specifically talking about character development. Character development for actors and writers. And they are a little different, but primarily that's what we're going to cover for this one. And this will, of course, have impact for producers and directors, maybe a little bit of DP work, but primarily writers and actors. So what I want to do is I want to make the distinction between how the character exists, or the character development is the character outside of the narrative or outside of the story that you're writing, that you're creating. And that's a very important distinction, because sometimes what happens is we put so much time and energy into developing the story, and then the characters relating to events in that story, and we only know the character in those circumstances, and the character exists outside of those outside of those circumstances. In fact, character actually exists in spite of the circumstances. Now, what I mean by that is characters. If you're working on a regular kind of personal, it's a personal story. It's a story of growth and transformation and development. There are exceptions, of course, but if it's that kind of a story, or even if it's the kind of story where there is no change in the main character, which is unusual, but it's possible. Usually you start off with a character that has a limitation, or that has an inability to express themselves. He or she doesn't have the full range of expression available to them. And then by the end of the narrative, their ability to express themselves, or for them to share themselves as a character, has expanded and grown, right? So those are the parameters. So that's how the character is different at the beginning of the narrative as opposed to the end of the narrative. And now what happens is we put our character in those circumstances that are of the narrative that will help heighten and accentuate those areas of development, those areas that the character needs to learn, to open up, and to grow. The very most simplistic one that I can think of right now is Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. So at the beginning of the narrative, Ebenezer Scrooge is tight-fisted. He doesn't like to spend money. He feels like he's getting ripped off. People always want something from him. Bah humbug, right? And at the end of the narrative, he's gift-giving, he's open, he's charming, he's open-hearted, right? All of that. So his character grew. Now, there's the scene where Scrooge is at work with Cratchit. There's the scene where he's sitting at home with food, having dinner before he goes to bed, to have those visitations by the three ghosts. So he exists, Scrooge still exists outside of those scenes that we see him in that narrative. And the narrative is being pushed by the author by making it on December 24th, right? Christmas Eve, or the day before. I think it's Christmas Eve. Yeah, it's on Christmas Eve. And he's like, well, I suppose you want to take Christmas off too, bah humbug. So he has that point of view on December 1st and January 10th and July 14th and all the other days, right? So it's not that the character doesn't have those traits. The character has those traits, but the author is putting them into a certain frame in order to accentuate it. But what we want to do is we want to be able to identify those character traits outside of the story narrative, so that we can have a better sense of what's really going on with the character, and where the conflict is, and where the misbehavior is, and where the character has a limitation. So those are the areas. Those are the areas to be able to extract, to pull apart what is character and what is story. Then, once you have that articulation and you can really have a sense of that, then when you put that character in the environment, in the circumstances of the story that you've created, now we have something to play with because you've consciously created the conflict, not created a circumstance where you feel like there's only one way for it to play out for everybody or for most people. So it becomes even more character specific because of the approach. Now, I welcome anyone to send me a note or to ask questions in the chat box or make a comment, and I can do another video for further articulation. But I really honestly feel that that is one of the challenge areas for most writers, is that the development of the character and the development of the story happen at the same time or side by side in parallel. And it's just not true, and it's not true to life, and it gives us severe limitations as to what is possible. So that's for the writer. For the actor, it's really important for the actor to see the character outside of these set circumstances that the actor knows so well for this character, and say, okay, well, what if you had this situation? What if you had that situation? What if he or she was interacting with this kind of a person instead of that kind of a person? And to find out where the edges of the character are. Where are those edges at the beginning of the narrative? Where are those edges at the end of the narrative? Have they expanded? Have they contracted? What's really operating here? So that when I go into the imaginary circumstances of the narrative of the story, I can bring more truth, more reality, more depth into that work. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed this little riff on characters exist outside of the narrative, and we'll be doing more and more of these. And again, feel free to subscribe and make comments and send me notes and ask questions, and I'll check them out and send you more information here and answer all the questions. Thanks for coming by. More delights to come.